Rain traced patterns down the glass windows of the Blackwell Tower, streaking across the skyline like smudged ink. 37 floors above the pulsing rhythm of Manhattan, Ethan Blackwell's world ticked in deadlines, meetings, and the glow of a screen that never slept. His schedule, rigid and packed, sat open on the glass desk, color-coded blocks with 5-minute margins. There was no space in there for softness, no gaps wide enough to let anything in that didn't come with a quarterly forecast. He adjusted his cufflinks and glanced at the time. 6:02 p.m. He was already late. "Where's the car?" he asked, rising from his chair. Janet, his assistant of 8 years, held out his coat. "It's waiting downstairs. I've canceled your dinner with the Tokyo team. She's waiting." He didn't have to ask who. Ethan hadn't meant to become this kind of man. Not really. He used to think time would slow down once he made it, once the IPO landed, once the market stabilized, once the buyout was final. But time had only gathered speed. And after Claire left, after the divorce papers and the shared custody negotiation turned into an arrangement that put all the parenting weight on him, he'd thrown himself into control. If he could not feel anything, at least he could run a world that made sense. Except when it came to Sophie. At 5 years old, his daughter had a way of sitting in silence that made him feel utterly unqualified. She spoke in questions more than answers and drew people in with the kind of openness that Ethan had long ago misplaced. She missed her mom in waves, sometimes quiet, sometimes loud, and lately she'd been having trouble sleeping. He stepped out of the elevator into the lobby. The driver opened the door. "Daddy," came the soft voice from the back seat. She was in her pink coat, her chin tucked behind a plush elephant. "Hi, Bean." He kissed the top of her head, then turned to the nanny. "She have dinner." The nanny nodded. "She wouldn't eat much. She said she wants you to read her the Rabbit book." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. The Rabbit book was The Runaway Bunny, one of those old picture books Claire used to read. He tried once, but his voice felt like cardboard when he read aloud. Sophie had turned away. "Daddy's voice doesn't sound like Mommy," she'd said. He didn't try again. That night he sat beside her bed, reading from his phone while she curled away from him. His voice faltered halfway through. She fell asleep with the elephant tucked against her chest, not him. It was Janet who eventually suggested the reading service. "There's a program through the library. They send people to read to kids. Might be nice to have a new voice." Ethan barely listened, distracted by revenue reports. "Fine, set it up once a week." He didn't think about it again. The following Thursday, he came home late from a board dinner. The apartment was quiet, lights dimmed, that soft hush of money everywhere, marble, glass, understated luxury. He was unbuttoning his shirt when he noticed the faint sound coming from Sophie's room. A woman's voice. His body tensed. He walked down the hallway, past the framed art Sophie had drawn with her unpredictable crayon logic. The door to her room was ajar. He pushed it gently. And there she was. The woman. She was seated in the rocking chair, one leg tucked under the other, book balanced across her knees. Her hair was tucked in a loose braid over her shoulder, and her voice floated through the air like warm tea in dusk. Sophie was curled beside her, utterly rapt. The woman read not like someone reciting lines, but like she was remembering them. Her voice didn't rise with affectation. It bent softly, dipped into the spaces between sentences, lingered on the pauses. The book, The Runaway Bunny. Ethan stood silently, unsure if he should interrupt. When the last page turned and the rabbit had finally gone to sleep, Sophie yawned and whispered something he didn't catch. The woman leaned over, kissed her forehead, too familiar, and only then noticed him. "Oh," she said, startled but not embarrassed, "you're back." Ethan straightened. "And you are." She stood, smoothing her sweater. "Myra Lane, from the library reading program." "You kissed her," he said before he could stop himself. "Myra didn't shrink. She asked me to, said that's how her mom used to say goodnight." He didn't reply, just looked at his daughter, already fast asleep, then back at this stranger who, apparently, had found a way in. "You're not what I expected." "I get that a lot," Myra said, not smiling, just observing him with a calm that unnerved him more than if she'd tried to please him. "She asked me to come twice a week. Is that okay with you?" Ethan hesitated. Everything in him wanted to say no. But Sophie was asleep, peaceful. Twice a week is fine. He walked away before she could say anything else. But even after she left, her voice stayed in the air. Over the next few weeks, Myra became a fixture in the background of Ethan's life. She came in the evenings, wore comfortable clothes, smelled faintly of something warm and earthy. He never asked what she did outside of this, but he noticed things. The ink stain on her wrist, the silver ring she twisted when she was thinking, the way Sophie lit up when Myra walked through the door. Myra didn't just read books, she gave them new breath. She let Sophie interrupt, ask questions, act out scenes. She didn't correct her grammar, she laughed at the right places. And sometimes when Ethan came home early enough to hear, she sang. Not full songs, just little hums, folk melodies, lullabies that didn't need lyrics. One night he lingered by the hallway again. Myra was reading something new, The Velveteen Rabbit. Sophie asked, "What's real?" Myra didn't answer right away. "It's when someone loves you for a long, long time," she said slowly. "Not just when you're pretty or perfect or quiet, but even when you're worn out, that's when you become real." Sophie blinked up at her. "Are you real?" "I think so," Myra whispered. "Are you?" Sophie giggled. "Sometimes." Ethan didn't know why that line stuck with him, but it did. The next morning, he opened Sophie's bedroom door to find her already awake, drawing. A picture of a girl holding hands with a rabbit. "Was she nice last night?" he asked. Sophie nodded. She said stories are kind of like love songs. They don't always rhyme, but they make you feel things. He stared at his daughter. Where did she come from? "Books," Sophie said simply, "and from listening." The first time he and Myra were in the same room for longer than 5 minutes, it was by accident. The nanny was out sick, Janet was unreachable, and Myra arrived just as Ethan's call got pushed. "I'll stay in the kitchen," she offered, slipping off her coat. But Sophie refused. "I want you both," she insisted, dragging Myra to the couch. "Daddy never hears the funny voices you do." Ethan sighed but sat down. Myra looked amused. She opened the book. It was one of those silly ones about a goose who thinks she's a cat. Myra read it with full commitment, squawking, purring, making Sophie roar with laughter. And something happened. Ethan laughed too. Not a polite chuckle, but a real laugh that startled even him. Myra paused, her eyes flicked to his, caught the crack in his armor. He looked away. After Sophie was asleep, Myra gathered her things quietly. At the door, she hesitated. "She misses her mom," she said gently. "But you're not failing her, you're just grieving differently." He didn't answer. Myra left. Ethan stood at the window long after, watching the lights of the city blur through the glass. And for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel like the busiest man in the world. He felt like a man who didn't know what to do with stillness. Winter curled around the city in layers, slush on the sidewalks, breath fogging against collars, the hush of snow that softened even the sharpest corners. Ethan hated winter. It slowed everything down, made traffic impossible, and introduced a level of unpredictability that unsettled his carefully controlled life. But Sophie loved it. She loved her pink boots, the squeak of fresh snow under her heels, and the way everything outside her window seemed softer, like someone had taken a white eraser to the noise. On Tuesday, Myra showed up with mittens in her coat pocket and a book titled Snow Day Soup. "We'll make some," she said as Sophie beamed up at her. "In real life, after the story." Ethan had just gotten off a call. He overheard the suggestion as he entered the kitchen and raised an eyebrow. "We don't have time for soup." Myra shrugged, pulling her braid tighter. "It's not fancy, broth, noodles, something that simmers. It's about the smell, not the ingredients." Ethan opened the fridge, half out of habit, and noticed a bag of carrots and some leftover chicken. Sophie tugged at his sleeve. "Please, Daddy." He looked at her, at the hope in her eyes, and something gave. "Fine, but I don't cook." "You'll stir," Myra said with a smirk. "That's your job." An hour later, the apartment smelled like something real, something warm and lived in. The soup was too salty, the noodles overcooked, but Sophie declared it perfect. Later, when she was asleep and Myra was rinsing bowls in the sink, Ethan stood beside her and reached for a towel. "She's different when you're here," he said quietly. "Calmer, like she's not waiting for something." Myra handed him a wet spoon. "She's not the only one." He didn't reply, just dried the spoon and let her words settle into his chest. It was Thursday when Sophie got sick. Not a cold, something heavier. She had a fever, wouldn't eat, and her small body curled in on itself like a shell. Ethan canceled everything. Meetings, calls, even a rare dinner with a potential investor. He sat by her bed, helpless. She drifted in and out of sleep, mumbling for her mom once, then Myra. He texted Myra at 11:04 p.m. "Can you come?" She didn't ask questions. 30 minutes later, she rang the buzzer, cheeks pink from the cold. She brought a bag of ginger, lemon, and a paperback copy of Charlotte's Web. "Soup again?" she asked gently. Ethan nodded, relieved. "Please." They moved like a team now, without speaking. Myra brewed tea, wiped Sophie's forehead with a cool cloth, and read from the book in a low, slow rhythm. When Sophie finally slept, Myra didn't rush to leave. They sat in the kitchen, lights dimmed, the hum of the dishwasher filling the silence. "She gets sick more in the winter," Ethan said, voice hoarse. "I never know what to do." "You're doing it," Myra replied. "You showed up. Most people think love has to look perfect. It doesn't. Sometimes it's just sitting in the dark with someone." He looked at her then, really looked. She was wearing a sweater with a loose thread by the cuff, no makeup, hair slightly frizzy from the snow. And somehow she looked more grounded than anyone he'd ever met. "Why do you do this?" he asked. "Read to kids, sit with strangers at midnight." She looked down at her tea. "Because someone once did it for me when I was small. Books kept me safe when life didn't. I guess I'm trying to return the favor." Ethan didn't push further, but when she left that night, he watched from the window until she was out of sight. Weeks passed, Sophie recovered. Life tried to return to its usual rhythm, but the rhythm had shifted. Myra came regularly, but sometimes they stayed longer after Sophie was asleep. Ethan started asking about the books, what they meant, why she chose them. Myra asked about his work, but only once. When he gave a vague answer, she let the silence speak louder. One night, while snow fell softly against the windows, Ethan lingered at the hallway again. Myra was reading Winnie the Pooh. Sophie interrupted. "Daddy, sit with us." He hesitated, then sat. Myra adjusted slightly, made room for him on the floor. She handed him the book midway. "Your turn," she said. He read, not well, not with her cadence, but earnestly. Sophie leaned against his arm. When the book ended, Myra didn't rush to fill the space. She just looked at Ethan, her expression unreadable. "Not bad," she murmured, still a little stiff. "Corporate upbringing," he offered. "We weren't really a storytime family." Myra tilted her head. "Maybe it's time to be one now." March brought warmer light and longer evenings. Ethan's days became a little less suffocating. He found himself ending meetings early, coming home before dinner, asking Sophie about her day instead of emails. One afternoon, he took her to the park. Sophie insisted on bringing a book, in case Myra comes. She doesn't just appear everywhere, you know. But Sophie just grinned. "You like her." Ethan froze. "I do not." "You smile different when she's here," Sophie said, not looking up. Not the work smile, the real one. Ethan didn't know how to respond to that. Then came the evening when Myra didn't come. No text, no call, just absence. Sophie waited by the door. Ethan checked his phone more times than he wanted to admit. Finally, he called the library. "She's on leave," the woman said. "Family emergency. We're not sure when she'll be back." The silence that followed was deafening. Sophie cried that night. Ethan tried to read but stumbled through every line. His voice shook and his hands were clumsy with the book. "I miss her," Sophie said quietly. "Did something bad happen?" "I don't know," Ethan admitted, "but we can write her a letter." They did, a simple one. Sophie drew a rabbit in the corner. A week passed, then two. Still no answer. Ethan carried the quiet like a second skin. And one morning, while tying Sophie's shoes, she looked up and asked, "Do people go away forever when they stop reading to you?" His heart cracked open. "No," he whispered. "Some people just need time, but the stories, they stay with you, that's the beautiful part." She nodded. "Then I'll read to you tonight, so you don't forget." Spring came in slow, deliberate breaths, first through puddles that reflected pale blue skies, then in the smell of thawed earth, in buds pressing out from trees like they'd been waiting just beneath the surface. Sophie started asking to open the windows again. The apartment began to breathe. But Myra was still gone. It had been 4 weeks. Ethan kept the letter on the counter, unopened, returned 2 days after they sent it. No forwarding address. He hadn't told Sophie. He didn't know how. At night, he still read to her. He tried new books, changed his voice, gave characters silly names. It wasn't the same, but it wasn't nothing either. They were building something. Sometimes, after Sophie fell asleep, Ethan would sit on the couch with a book of his own, holding it open long past the point of reading. He hadn't realized how much space Myra had taken up until she left it behind. Then one afternoon, a Sunday of all things, he came back from the store to find Janet waiting outside his apartment. He blinked. "Is something wrong?" "No," she said, "but someone's waiting inside." Before he could ask who, the door opened. And there she was. Myra. She stood in the foyer, hair unbraided, coat unbuttoned. She looked exhausted, paler, smaller, but her eyes were the same, still watching, still soft. "I'm sorry," she said. Ethan set the grocery bag down slowly. "Where have you been?" "My dad," she said, her voice catching slightly. "He got sick. I had to go back home." "Back?" "Vermont, farm town, no service unless you stand on one foot by the mailbox. I left in such a rush I forgot everything, even your number." He didn't realize how tightly he'd been holding his breath. Sophie burst in from her room before he could reply, shrieking, "Myra!" She knelt, arms open. Sophie barreled into her, nearly knocking them both over. "You were gone forever," she said, muffled in Myra's sweater. "I read all your books and Daddy tried to sing, but it was bad." Myra laughed, eyes shining. "I missed you too, Wildflower." When Sophie pulled away, Myra looked up at Ethan. "I don't expect anything," she said. "I just needed to make sure you knew I didn't mean to disappear." Ethan crossed his arms, not out of defense, but because if he didn't, he wasn't sure what he'd do. "You said stories stay with us," he murmured, "but you left one unfinished." "I know." He took a breath. "Are you staying?" "For a while," she said, "if it's still okay." Sophie answered for them both. "It's more than okay, you're part of the story now." It didn't go back to how it was before. It got quieter, slower, more intentional. Myra didn't read every night. Sometimes she came for dinner. Sometimes she stayed late and helped Sophie build blanket forts with string lights and whispered stories. Ethan started noticing things. How Myra always made room for questions, for silence, for the curve of a child's mood. How she never corrected Sophie when she rewrote endings. How she made Ethan feel like he wasn't failing, even when he was tired, distracted, unsure. And Myra noticed him too. One night after Sophie was in bed, Ethan poured her a glass of wine and handed her a folded piece of paper. "What's this?" "A story," he said. "I wrote one for Sophie." She looked at him, stunned. "You wrote?" He shrugged. "Terrible handwriting. Worst plot, but I tried." She opened it. It was about a dragon who didn't want to guard treasure anymore, who wanted to learn to cook soup instead. She read it twice. "It's not bad," she said finally, a little stiff. He smiled, corporate upbringing. They both laughed. The sound settled into the space between them, less awkward this time. "You could do this more," Myra said gently. "Write, be part of the bedtime." "I'm trying," he said, "not just with her." Their eyes met. It was a fragile thing, that moment. Nothing said out loud, no declarations. Just a pause held a little longer than it needed to be. Later that week, they took Sophie to the spring fair. It was crowded, loud, full of balloon animals and melted cotton candy. Sophie ran ahead, chasing a puppet show, and Ethan and Myra followed, not touching but walking close enough their hands brushed now and then. "She's so free here," Ethan said, watching his daughter dance in front of the stage. "She's safe," Myra replied. "That's what gives her wings." He looked at her. "You helped with that." She smiled. "So did you." The show ended. Sophie ran back, cheeks flushed. "Let's go home," she said, grabbing both their hands. She held them together like it made sense, like it was already true. And Ethan didn't let go. One night in May, after Sophie had fallen asleep with her head on Myra's lap, Myra stayed a while longer. They sat in the quiet living room, the window open to the sound of taxis below and birds that hadn't yet gone to sleep. "Did you ever think your life would look like this?" Myra asked. Ethan leaned back. "Not once. I thought it would be suits, numbers, boardrooms." "And now?" He looked toward the hallway, where a stuffed elephant peeked from Sophie's bed. "Now I think I got everything wrong," he said, "but maybe it's not too late to get it right." Myra was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "The best stories change halfway through." He looked at her. And for once, he didn't try to fill the silence with explanations or logic. He just sat there next to her, both of them watching the world go quiet. Summer brought the kind of heat that made the pavement steam and turned the city's pulse into something slower, lazier. Windows stayed open late into the night. The skyline shimmered like a mirage. In the Blackwell apartment, the air conditioning hummed low, and the corners of rooms filled with signs of a life Ethan hadn't planned for. Coloring books on the coffee table, tiny sandals by the door, a blanket tent that no one had the heart to dismantle. There was a rhythm now. Not perfect, not without the occasional clash of schedules or forgotten appointments, but real. Ethan still worked long hours, still answered calls during dinner sometimes. But he came home earlier. He said no more often. And Sophie, no longer just adapting to his world, had started to pull him into hers. Myra had become a kind of quiet constant. She wasn't every day, but she was every week. Sometimes she'd bring used books wrapped in twine or recipes scrawled on the back of receipts. Sometimes she came with stories, and sometimes with nothing at all but her presence, which Ethan had come to realize was never empty. One evening she arrived later than usual, hair still damp from the shower, sandals in hand because she'd broken one and walked the last 2 blocks barefoot. Sophie was already asleep. She'd had a long day at the museum, and Ethan opened the door to find Myra winded, laughing softly. "I'm a mess," she said. "You're late," he replied, though without edge. "Had to take the long way, subway stalled. I thought you might have given up on me." He stepped back. "Sophie's asleep." Myra hesitated. "Then I can go." He didn't answer right away. Or maybe he did. He just moved aside, let her in. They ended up in the kitchen, the way they always seemed to. Myra sat barefoot on a stool while Ethan poured them both something cold. "You're not a mess," he said, handing her the glass. She tilted her head. "What am I then?" He didn't know how to answer without saying too much, so he just said, "Unexpected." She smiled at that, not in the way that meant flattered, in the way that meant seen. A few minutes passed in silence before she said, "You've changed." "I've had help." "I didn't mean me, I meant her." He nodded. "She changes everything." "And you let her." Ethan looked at her for a long time. "I'm still learning how." Myra reached across the counter, brushed a stray breadcrumb into her palm. "You're doing better than most." They didn't touch, not yet, but there was something in the air between them, something settling. That night when she left, she kissed his cheek. Brief, casual, like it might have meant nothing. But his hand came up to his face afterward, and he stood in the dark kitchen for a long time, heart louder than he wanted to admit. The next few weeks carried something new in them, a hum under the surface. It wasn't just friendship anymore, but it also wasn't quite anything else. Ethan noticed things, the way Myra always turned her head slightly when she laughed, the way she listened without interruption, the way Sophie reached for her hand without looking. Myra, too, watched Ethan differently now. She noticed how his voice softened when he spoke to his daughter, how he'd begun to narrate his thoughts aloud, letting Sophie into his decision-making, giving her space to be heard. But something unspoken held them apart. Maybe it was the child in the middle, maybe it was the history, maybe it was fear. One Friday night, after reading Harold and the Purple Crayon, Sophie had asked, "Can Myra sleep over?" Ethan froze. Myra smiled gently. "Not tonight," she said, "but maybe another time." Sophie nodded, already fading into sleep. After Myra left, Ethan stood on the balcony, wine untouched in his hand. The city below looked endless. He felt the weight of possibility pressing against his ribs. He hadn't let anyone in like this since Claire. Hadn't trusted someone in his home, in his routine, in his daughter's life. But Myra didn't take space the way Claire had. She didn't demand it. She waited until it was offered. And that made all the difference. 2 days later, Ethan got a call. A last-minute tech summit in Singapore, press heavy, a room full of billion-dollar minds. He hadn't traveled since Sophie started kindergarten. He sat at the breakfast table, watching his daughter turn her toast into puzzle pieces. "Would you be okay if Daddy went away for a little?" Her eyes flicked up. How little? 4 days, maybe 5. She looked down. Will Myra be here? Ethan hesitated. She could be if she wants. Sophie smiled, small and sure. Then I'll be okay. He called Myra that afternoon, explained, apologized, asked. "I'd stay here," she said, "with her. If you're comfortable." There was a pause on the line. I'd be honored." The night before he left, they all watched a movie on the couch. Sophie fell asleep first, then Myra, her head resting against Ethan's shoulder. He looked down at her, heart caught in a quiet place. She stirred. "Are you nervous?" He nodded, but not about the flight. She didn't ask what he meant, she just took his hand. A silent promise passed between them. No labels, no urgency, just this. Something real. Something growing. The trip was a success. The summit applauded him, news articles quoted him, his company's stock spiked. And all he wanted was to be home. When he walked through the door on a late Thursday evening, he expected to find Sophie asleep. He didn't expect to find Myra curled up in his armchair, reading. She stood slowly. "Welcome back." Ethan stared at her. "You stayed." She nodded. "She fell asleep early. I was just waiting for you." He crossed the room. Neither of them spoke. He kissed her. It wasn't sudden, it wasn't rushed. It was something that had been slowly blooming between them, unspoken and inevitable. When they pulled back, she smiled. "Was that your version of a bedtime story?" He laughed, "Something like that." They didn't make promises that night. They didn't need to. The beginning of autumn came like a held breath exhaled, cool air rushing in, peeling back the heat and noise of summer. Trees flared into color across Central Park, and Sophie started kindergarten with a red backpack almost too big for her. She was taller now, braver too. Myra took her on the first day while Ethan was stuck in a board meeting he couldn't move. He stood in the glass conference room, tie tight around his throat, watching the clock like it owed him something. At 9:03 a.m. a photo came through. Sophie in front of the school gates, hand in Myra's, her gap-toothed smile too wide to be nervous. Myra's other hand held a book tucked under her arm. Ethan left the meeting 15 minutes early. No one stopped him, they didn't dare. By the time he reached the school, the bell had already rung and the yard was empty. Myra sat on the front steps with 2 coffees and a folded note in her lap. She went in like she'd been doing it all her life, she said, only looked back once. He took the cup, sat beside her. "I hated missing it." "You didn't," she said, offering him the note. "She made this in the car, told me not to read it, said it was for you only." He opened it, crayon scribbles filled the page. A stick figure version of him, a tiny Myra beside him, and Sophie in the middle with a speech bubble. "I love my storytime family." He swallowed hard. She said that. Myra nodded. They sat in silence for a while. There were still things they hadn't said, but the important ones were already between them, stitched into moments like this. The apartment looked different now, not because anything had changed decor-wise, but because of what filled the air. Laughter, music, days that didn't end in tension. Myra didn't move in, not officially, but there was a toothbrush in the guest bathroom, a drawer with her sweatshirts, books left stacked on the nightstand beside Ethan's bed. They were slow about it, careful. Because Sophie came first, always. But there were new routines now. Sunday breakfasts with all three of them crammed into the kitchen, flour on noses. Evening walks where Sophie made them all hold hands and swing her between them. Nights when Myra read one page, Ethan the next, until Sophie fell asleep somewhere in the middle. And after she was asleep, the world belonged to them. Ethan, who once counted every hour in profit margins and productivity, had started measuring his days differently. In the weight of Myra's hand in his, in the quiet click of Sophie's door when they checked on her one last time before bed. One night long after midnight, Myra stood at the balcony window, her arms wrapped around herself. Ethan came up behind her, wrapped her in his warmth. She leaned into him without hesitation. "I used to think love was loud," she said softly, "flashy, complicated. And now I think it's this." She turned in his arms. A girl who believes stories are songs, a man who didn't think he could be soft, and quiet nights like this one, where no one needs to say anything to feel it. Ethan kissed her, slow and sure. When they pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his. "You know, the first time I saw you, I thought you were impossible. And now I think you were just waiting to remember how to listen." Months passed, seasons shifted. And one evening in late November, just before the holidays, Sophie brought home a school assignment: draw your family. She drew 3 figures. Herself in the middle, her dad tall with glasses holding a book, and Myra beside them reading, her voice drawn in soft musical lines above her head. Below she'd written, "Sometimes families are made of stories, and sometimes they write new ones together." Ethan read it 3 times, then once more aloud, his voice catching on the last sentence. Myra stood beside him, quiet. He looked at her. "Do you ever think we would have ended up here?" "No," she said, "but I think we were always heading this way. We just didn't know the plot yet." They didn't need to rush. There was no grand proposal, no dramatic confession. Just a steady unfolding. A man learning to slow down, a woman choosing to stay, a child leading them both forward one story at a time. And a home where bedtime wasn't just routine, but ritual. Where love was read aloud, page by page, like a song they all knew by heart.